But first, over the weekend, I've done little else other than trawl through all the documents and testimony out of last week's hotel quarantine inquiry. Now, remember this lesson: in politics, it's never the crime so much as it is a cover-up. 10,000 COVID infections, almost 800 Victorians dead, billions lost out of the economy, businesses that will never reopen, workers that will never get their old jobs back, mortgages that will end up being foreclosed on, and ordinary people who have taken their life unable to cope with the lockdowns. The hardest and toughest lockdowns now in Victoria, let's not forget, than anywhere else in the world. In other states, the decision to take up the PM's offer to use the Australian Defence Force at the hotel quarantine door saved lives and livelihoods. Without a doubt, Victoria's decision to go it alone and use private security contributed to the greatest failure of government in Australian history. And yet minister after minister, official after official, says they don't know who made the fateful decision, all the way up to the Premier. Those who know the Premier Daniel Andrews know he's a control freak. He totally dominates his government. More staff in his office than the Prime Minister has in his. Yet no one knows, we're told, no one knows why the bouncer got the job rather than the brigadier or the police sergeant. If you were to believe the Premier back in August, his evidence to a parliamentary inquiry into the quarantine crisis was this.
Again, I think it is fundamentally incorrect to assert that there was hundreds of ADF staff on offer and somehow someone said no.
But that doesn't square, does it? With this commitment from the Prime Minister back on Friday, the 27th of March, straight out of the National Cabinet meeting that decided mandatory hotel quarantine would be implemented right across Australia for returning travellers using the Australian Defence Force.
The ADF will be there to put boots on the ground, to support them in their enforcement efforts, and I thank the ADF for their great support in turning up to this task. We believe these important actions are the most important we can take right now because of what you've done, Australia.
Now, Daniel Andrews, of course, was present on the National Cabinet meeting hookup. We know he heard the offer of ADF support for hotel quarantine because on the same day, March 27, in a press conference, he had this to say.
Premier, in terms of keeping people in these quarantine hotel rooms, how will that work? Will there be guards at the door stopping?
Yeah, we'll utilise private security. We'll also utilise members of Victoria Police, and I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister for his offer of support from the Australian Defence Force. I think people will do the right thing. I think people know and understand this is serious, and they're coming home because they know that this is the safest place to be.
Australian Defence Force. But again in August, he said this.
Again, I think it is fundamentally incorrect to assert that there was hundreds of ADF staff on offer and somehow someone said no.
But of course, it doesn't end there, does it? Backed up, as we now know, by direct letters from the Prime Minister to the Victorian Premier, July 4, July 6, July 11, more and more offers of ADF support, all while the state's COVID infection rate was climbing and deaths were mounting. Yet this from the Victorian Premier in sworn evidence at Friday's inquiry when asked about an email on April 8 offering ADF troops from the PM's chief bureaucrat to his own Chris Eccles.
Given that it's so at odds with what I took away from the National Cabinet meeting, I think it would have been very significant to me, and I can't predict what outcome it might have had, but I certainly would have wanted to know.
Now, let me be very, very clear here. He says, the Premier, that if he knew defence support was available back when this email was sent on April 8, if he knew, he might have made a different decision in relation to hotel quarantine. If he knew back on April 8, he says. Well, he did know. There's nothing like the horse's mouth, is there? Here he is again in March.
Premier, in terms of keeping people in these quarantine hotel rooms, how will that work? Will there be guards at the door stopping people?
We'll utilise private security. We'll also utilise members of Victoria Police, and I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister for his offer of support from the Australian Defence Force. I think people will do the right thing. I think people know and understand this is serious, and they're coming home because they know that this is the safest place to be.
Well, backpedalling hard faced with this evidence on camera from March. Since Friday's inquiry, Daniel Andrews has tried to spin his way out of all of this, claiming he didn't think the PM's offer of defence support meant extensive support. Here he is.
I had absolutely no expectation whatsoever that in the establishment and the running of hotel quarantine there would be significant, extensive ADF support.
And all over the weekend, spinning it again and again.
You omitted a very important word, extensive support. I had no expectation whatsoever of extensive support coming to us from the ADF. No one had any expectation that there would be extensive support.
But buried in the evidence to the official quarantine inquiry is this official stand-up order from the Chief of the Australian Defence Force, General Angus Campbell. It's dated Friday, 27 March, the very day that National Cabinet's decision to enforce hotel quarantine, making it clear that ADF troops were up and ready, was requested by the Prime Minister and announced by the Prime Minister. It's a stand-up order, it's called in military terms, from Australia's highest military officer. And I'd say to the Premier, an offer of Defence Force support doesn't get any more extensive than that. But still he tries weasel words again, trying to infer over the weekend that it was only New South Wales, he thought, coming out of the March National Cabinet that would get what he now spins as so-called extensive support.
That is what I took away from the National Cabinet meeting in very plain and clear terms. I fully acknowledge that there would be in my judgment, a very different arrangement in New South Wales. I detailed why that was the case yesterday. I'll go through it again for you, just for completeness sake. One, cruise ships. Ruby Princess was literally happening at that time. The number of cruise ships, I think Sydney Harbour was rather full at the time, with cruise ships that have been redirected from across other ports. And of course, there's not the insubstantial issue of more international flights going into Sydney than Melbourne.
But here again, Daniel Andrews is caught out because he just doesn't know how the Commonwealth government works in practice, and I do. First, the cruise ship claim doesn't wash because more cruise ships would have meant more Australian Border Force resources in New South Wales, not Australian Defence Force resources. Different roles, Dan, different roles. Second, again, that stand-up order from General Campbell. New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria in the stand-up order, all to get the same extensive level of resources. 100 military personnel as an immediate response in the larger states and 50 only in the smaller states. So here's where we are tonight. Not only did Daniel Andrews know right from the very beginning of his hotel quarantine program that private security would be involved, but he also knew right from the very beginning that the military were available to help Victoria. Months and months later, when infections were climbing high in June and he couldn't hide from his hotel quarantine failures, Victorian officials urgently sought 850 soldiers late at night. It was granted in under an hour from the Defence Minister in Canberra. But then Victoria inexplicably the next day changed their mind. There's another story in all of that too, and another as to why the Victorian police weren't used in hotel quarantine in Melbourne like they were in every other state. But that's for tomorrow night. I'll say this though, from what I've now read of all the evidence, it's not just Jenny Mikakos that needs to fall on a sword. Tonight, every decent Labor person in this state should be ashamed at what's gone on in Victoria, and every Australian's right to be just as angry, because in the end, every Australian is going to pay the cost.